There may be times when we need to know if controllers are connected or disconnected from the system, so I'm going to introduce a new read-only property called status that can be accessed at any time to determine if there are any connected controllers. I'm going to take things a bit further too and emit on and off events when controllers are connected and disconnected so that an application can rely on the event-driven nature of JavaScript to know when the status changes instead of having to constantly pull the status property. I'm not going to be keeping track of the state of individual controllers, but the code I will be adding in this lesson should get you headed in that direction. As I mentioned before, at this time I don't have a need to differentiate between each of the different controllers connected to the system, so the module status property is going to reflect a collective status, so to speak, where it will have a value of on when one or more controllers are turned on, and a value of off when all controllers are turned off. The first thing I'm going to do is add a new variable called current status with a default value of off, which will be used for determining when the status changes so that the appropriate events can be emitted. In order for any application using this module to know what the status is at a given point, I need to expose this variable, which I'll do in the constructor function as a read-only property. Now, if you're not familiar with the syntax here, what I'm saying is, define a new property called status on the new object returned from the constructor, which is accessed using the this keyword. The object literal passed in as the third argument here is called the descriptor, which specifies attributes for the property being defined. In this case, with the get syntax, I'm saying that the status property being defined is read-only, and here's the function that should be called whenever the status property is accessed. Inside that function, I'm just simply returning out the current status variable I defined above. This property can certainly be useful, but as I mentioned at the start of this lesson, by only defining this property, any applications using this module will have to constantly pull the status property to know when the status changes. To avoid having to do that, I want to offer two new events to consumer applications called on and off that can be handled when the status changes. Before going any further, I do want to point out that the documentation on npm for the gamepad module indicates that gamepad offers two events, attach and remove, which should be triggered whenever controllers are turned on and off. However, I could not actually get them to fire, so I had to come up with a bit of a hacky workaround to accomplish the same thing, which is what I will be demonstrating in the remainder of this lesson. If you want to take a shot at using those events instead and can get them to work, then, well, more power to you. My approach is just simply an alternative if you need a workaround. I will add a new function inside of init called updateStatus, which will be responsible for updating the current status variable and emitting the appropriate events as the status changes. With the work I did in the previous lesson, I made it really easy to tell if there are any connected controllers, so I can just call the getConnectedControllerIDs function, and then check the length of the array returned. If the length is greater than 0, I will say that the status is on. Otherwise, I'll say that the status is off. Now, in order to only fire events when the status is changed from off to on, and vice versa, I will compare the value of the local updated status variable to the value of the current status variable I defined a bit ago. If the values are different, then I will update the value of the current status variable to that of the updated status, and then fire an event corresponding to the new status. I need to call this new function periodically so that the status change happens in near real time. That way there isn't a huge delay between the time the physical controllers are turned on or off and the time the status is updated in this module. For this, I will utilize setInterval to call the updateStatus function every half a second. Now currently I have two setInterval calls in place. The first one checks for new events fired by the controllers, and the second one checks for connected and disconnected devices. Now rather than adding a third setInterval call, I'm actually just going to cut out the gamepad.detectDevices call, drop in a call to update status, and then paste the detectDevices call inside of the getConnectedControllerIDs function. With this change, the detectDevices call is still going to be made every half a second since the new updateStatus function calls into getConnectedControllerIDs. In order to test out the new changes here, I will switch over to the test file and add a couple of new event handlers for the on and off events, which will just simply log the value of the status variable. Whenever I run this, I should see a value of on whenever a controller is turned on, and then a value of off whenever all of the connected controllers are turned off. I'll start by just turning on one controller, And there's the on status change. Now if I turn the controller off, I should see another status change logged. Bingo bango. All right. Now if I turn two controllers on, I should only see one on event logged. Okay, the first one is on, as you can see, and now I'll turn on the second controller. Nothing. Perfect. Now I know you can't see what I'm doing, so you're going to have to trust that I actually did turn on a second controller, but it should be evident by the extraneous access move events logged here. You can also code up the modifications in this lesson and test this out for yourself if you have a couple of controllers available. Okay, now if I turn one controller off, I should not see a status change logged. Alright, and if I turn the second controller off, I should see the status change being logged. Perfect. That's really all of the functionality I'm going to be adding to the controller module in this course, so in the next lesson, I'm going to begin refactoring the module a bit to make it a little more efficient.